Okay, which gets us right off into our next panel, titled Climate, Planet and Cities. Timon, Hilke, Rita, Johanna, please come to the stage. I have mics here for you. I have one extra mic. So take a seat. However you want to sit, feel free. 2 on the couch, 2 on the chairs. There's 1 on the mic. So 5 was on the back. 4. 2. Just as a means of the introduction, Timon McPhearson at the New Lab at the New School here in New York, Rita Sousa Silva, Freiburg University, and just as I learned, incoming professor at University of Leiden in the Netherlands, Hilke Berger from Hafencity, Hamburg, and Johanna Lovecchio from the Resilience Center at Columbia University will enlighten us on all things climate, planet, and cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. It's great to be here. Thanks everyone for coming out. The first thing I wanted to say, and I'm just going to kick a little bit off with the challenge here, is that it's raining again. It's been raining every weekend for the last 6 or 7 weekends. I don't know if New Yorkers are really ready for some sun. I don't know about you. But I mention it because just a couple weeks ago, we broke records for the most rainfall ever recorded in a 24-hour period here when Tropical Storm Ophelia came through. And that's interesting because just 2 years ago, as dramatic as some of those images were, just 2 years ago, we broke all-time historical records for the most rainfall to ever fall in New York in a single hour when Hurricane Ida came through. That record was set just days before by Hurricane Henri in New York that had just recently broke that record. And so I want to make 4 points just to set a little bit of the challenge, and I really appreciate the discussion around what do we mean by resilience, because I think the reason we're talking about resilience is because there is a very pressing challenge around that. And the first point is this, is that the climate-driven extreme events, whether it's flooding from extreme rainfall or coastal flooding, winter storms, heat waves, and others, are becoming much more frequent, they're becoming more intense, and they're causing a lot more damage. I'll just give you a couple points to anchor this. Here in the United States, in this year, we've had $24 billion disasters in 1 year. So just from a sort of economic standpoint, it's pretty remarkable where we're at. If you zoom back, someone said they came of age in the 80s. If you go back to 1980, just in terms of economic losses, ooh, I can talk a little bit quieter, okay? In terms of economic losses, 2.6 trillion in economic losses from these types of natural disasters just in the United States. And that kind of pales in comparison if you look at it on a global scale. So that's my first point. Things are getting a little bit more dramatic, and it just underlines the need for multiple types of resilience, and cities have a really important role to play. The second point I want to make is that my work on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, last year we put out thousands of pages of information about the state of the climate on the planet. I'll give you one fact from that, and that is that the amount of carbon already in our atmosphere suggests that this increasing frequency of extreme events is going to keep happening for another 20 to 30 years. What I mean is, climate change, no matter how rapidly we deeply decarbonize and transition our economic systems, is built in for 2 to 3 more decades. So this is another layer of challenge on top of the current experience we're having. The third point I want to make is about cities, that the global population growth that will happen over the next few decades will largely happen all in cities. So we have this interesting confluence of rising, in fact, accelerating climate change impacts. Second, accelerating population in the urban environment. And then this concentration of economy and infrastructure and people in cities that really makes cities, I think, the locus for where resilience action needs to happen. And I think we'll talk about what already is happening. There's a lot of kind of amazing pieces there. On top of that, and this is, I'd like you to kind of imagine the world that is resilient. one estimate puts it that by 2050, to accommodate this new urban population, there's about $90 trillion in infrastructure that needs to be built. Imagine if all of that new infrastructure, new cities, retrofitting old cities, was resilient infrastructure. The IPCC said we have to do climate resilient development. That, I think, is our challenge to take on. How do we develop differently in a way that is resilient? And the last point I'll make, and then I'll hand it off to the rest of our speakers, is that we also know that both current and all projections moving forward, that the actual impacts of climate change are not felt equally, right? They're extremely disproportionate. So low income, immigrant, migrant communities are really bearing the brunt of this. So when we talk about resilience, we need to be not just talking about resilience to what, which I sort of set up as climate extremes as one, but also resilience for whom. And that resilience for whom is very critical. I'll end with one little story about this, and what you're seeing behind me is a projection of where a rainfall event like the Ida storm that happened 2 years ago is likely to occur in New York. One of the things you see there, because this is just the flood hazard information in blue, is it's kind of everywhere. It's all across the city, but the impacts of that are not felt the same way. 800,000 people in New York City are living below the floodplain and live in environmental justice communities. So these are the kinds of things that I think we really have to come to terms with when we think about resilience, which is who do we focus the limited funding as we try to accelerate that, given that only 10% of global finance is focused on adaptation. Yes, we need to rapidly, deeply decarbonize, and we need that finance, but we're going to have to really scale that up. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity in terms of infrastructure to change that development trajectory. And I want to hear from what the rest of you are doing in terms of the exciting progress that I know that's already happening on the ground that we need to scale up.
So next is me, and since everyone is fed up with the rain, I brought you some sun. So I actually came from Freiburg, so I don't know if everyone is familiar with Freiburg. Those who are not, you should visit. You really should. So that's a city on the left, and Freiburg is very beautiful, but it's also the warmest town in Germany. So when we talk about climate change, we talk about rain, but most often we talked about it's getting hotter and hotter. And if you move to Freiburg, you will see it's definitely true. So what you see on the right side, it was my first summer in Freiburg, and back then we broke all the records of temperature. It was just super hot. And actually Freiburg is next to the Black Forest. So one could think of, we were quite okay because I work with trees and there's plenty of trees in Freiburg. Moving from North America back to Europe and to Freiburg, I was like, what I'm doing here? There's already trees everywhere. They don't need me. I hope I convinced them otherwise. And that's part of the research we do. So we talked about how to build for future, how to make cities more resilient. But actually sometimes we already have these things over there. So part of the research we did was looking at the green spaces, so the parks, the trees in the streets, and who lives here in New York or in US? Okay, if you have to walk like 10-15 minutes, who has a park within a 50-minute walk? Not too bad, not too bad. Okay, I'm impressed. But like as we talk about the justice of access to green spaces, in German what we learn is like more than 80% live within a 10-minute walk. This is great. So we have already parks, and Germans love their parks, they love their trees. But we found out is like when it's really hot and they don't go to parks. People are not aware that they can use these parks to cool down, to spend an afternoon. So even when we have this infrastructure in place, we still need to get the message out. And we need to take good care of the trees, because the trees also need to get some care, and to involve people in taking care of these spaces. So that's a little bit of how I see the resilient future of the cities and societies. More trees.
Yeah, thank you, Rita. I think I can relate directly to the trees. What you can see here is a funny picture on the first glance, maybe. but it's not a funny thing that is happening here, and I think you have the same problem in every city all over the world. We have a lot of sealed surfaces, right? Cities are built out of concrete, and this leads to heat islands everywhere in the city, so that you can burn an egg on the street, really. So I think the challenge that we kind of need to embrace is how can we adapt to those changes, and I think one answer to that is that we need to take into account different perspectives of urban planning. So we really need to shift our focus. And what you can see here, so I'm from Hamburg, I'm the scientific lead of the City Science Lab. What we're doing there is we develop digital tools to collaboratively plan transformative cities, more or less. And we thought, okay, yeah, we can do a lot with that. We can do like multi-stakeholder participation workshops and the like, but still we are missing somehow the slick interfaces that we are creating. So we invited artists, 15 international artists, to use our tools, to hack them, to come up with different perspectives. And this is one outcome of the project that you can see here, because it's a project called Tree Planting Robots. And the idea behind it is that robots are kind of scrolling through the cities. They hide in daytime in nurseries, and at night they come out. They have sensors, and they detect heat islands. And whenever they find a heat island, they just like drill a hole, plant a tree. And this might be not very convenient in regards of infrastructural issues, as you can see here, because most heat islands are like on crossings, right, like in the city centers, really. So this shift of perspective, I think, needs to be taken seriously. So you can obviously plant trees in parks and have like nice good zones, but maybe it's not about the human perspective of urban planning. Maybe we have to consider and shift our perspectives and take into account like the real issues that we need to tackle. So I think this is a challenge, and with this I'm handing over to you.
Wonderful. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much for having me and such good segues. I'm Johanna Lovecchio, and I think a lot about these issues as well. And a lot of my kind of operating hypothesis or operating space is built on the assumption that urban design, policy, and planning and infrastructure choices over the last 100 years or so have made cities less resilient, and that they have indeed created a lot of the vulnerability and the risk that we see and the social inequity that is very material in the world. The other thing is really centering these ideas that are coming up around environmental and climate justice, which is defined broadly that there are communities in our own city as well as in the global south with a lot of the communities that I work with that are not only disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards and toxicity or things like air pollution, as well as climate risk, like extreme heat or flooding, but also broadly disproportionately impacted by climate change itself, and that the burden of adaptation to climate risk and vulnerability is disproportionately shared on a global scale. Countries that produced and continue to produce the least amount of emissions bear the heaviest cost in adaptation. And I think that poses a really important set of questions for all of us as we contemplate these ideas of resilient. Just one sort of example from Upper Manhattan, I once heard a community member say in a meeting, why is it that we are always the ones that have to be more resilient? And I just want to offer that to this space as well. But a lot of my work is also about sort of grounding in the realities of what it takes to implement some of this work with communities. Up on this slide are some snapshots from a recent and ongoing partnership that we're engaged with at Columbia with communities in Colombia. Colombia at a national scale is going through major political transition and change, and is also one of the leading voices of climate action on the global stage. On the climate justice point, they have recently asked and requested for $800 billion in losses and damages, which is what they estimate year over year, which is what they estimate they need to overcome what they cannot adapt to on their own.
And on the ground, and not on the global scale, and what often doesn't get the attention of global forums like the COPs or other major spaces that convene around these challenges, are the communities that are doing the really hard work every day. And my job is about seeking those communities out, assuming that those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution, and that we should really be taking their lead. So these are some snapshots from a community that we've been working with in Cartagena. The Caribbean is a leading voice on climate action in the global stage. And in this particular community in Cartagena, it's quite different than if you've ever traveled as a tourist to Cartagena and sort of experienced what's inside the colonial wall. Outside of that wall is a very, very different story and set of images and realities that are very much impacted not just by climate risk. So in this community, that looks like flooding, that looks like stormwater damage, that looks like exposure to urban heat, that also looks like healthy food access, that looks like waste management, that looks like transportation challenges. It also looks like the realities of informality, which is something that we don't often grapple with in the global north, but poses really difficult challenges for many communities in adaptation when you don't have rights to your land, but are the stewards of those lands. Where does that leave you? So in this community in particular, they're doing incredible work on reimagining amphibious transportation systems. They're reimagining amphibious housing typologies, and we partnered with them to think about how we might bridge the gap between the urban design capacities of the university and students who are thinking about policy and practice and case making in service of their challenges. So what they're doing there is they're replanting the mangroves as critical coastal restoration and flood protection infrastructure. Many communities are thinking about how nature itself is the best infrastructure that we have. We have to reimagine cities with the natural infrastructure that they have, and thinking about how to enliven some of that new imagination for what the urban can look like that is much more equitable and much more derived from lessons from nature. And in turn, what we do is then we work with local government who are striving for, in the best of cases, creating access to funding and financing for those types of projects, or creating new policies or political platforms and agendas, and engaging in civil society around corruption or around institutional change or around what it takes to change the zoning codes or building codes to enable some of these types of projects. So I'd offer that as sort of a systematic way of working from very big to very small challenges, and the opportunities that we have to create supportive architectures around community that help them sort of pave the way.
We're just going to keep going, right? One of the things you said, maybe I'll just offer a couple thoughts and see where this goes, is this sort of focus on, nowadays we refer to them as nature-based solutions, right? This sort of investment in the nature around us as one of the critical opportunity spaces. And there's a lot of alignment with the speakers around this. I love that because I think it's a repositioning of the way in which we think about climate change as this natural pressure that nonetheless is anthropogenic in terms of how we've sort of ramped it up, but also the way in which we've developed cities largely. So there's a lot of great examples, I think, in some of the older European cities, where we've really taken this sort of 20th century paradigm of urban development that is highly paved and has all these field services. And so we're kind of like rediscovering that nature can be our ally. And yet, you also mentioned, and I'm just picking up off of a couple of your comments, that there's a systematic way of kind of thinking about this. And in fact, I'd say there's many systems. So nature's one of the systems that we have to work with, but there's multiples. And so I just thought maybe we might break this down and see where you're all aligning in terms of what it means for cities to become more adapted and to be more resilient. And I might frame that as we need to have resilient social systems. We need to have our resilience for people and institutions. Our infrastructure and our technologies need to be resilient. Our economies need to be resilient. And sort of the question is nature can be cross-cutting in some of these ways, but of course, you mentioned this before, nature needs to be resilient too when we were talking about the trees, right? So there's a lot of aspects that we have to line up and deal with simultaneously across the complexity of what cities really are. And then that breaks down into another kind of system is what are the mechanisms for that? Is this about governance, changes in the way we govern our cities and the way that they're structured? Is this about finance? What are those pieces? And I guess I would challenge us all to think about how we can work across what often are silos. They're silos in the way our governments are set up. We have departments of transportation who are focused on transportation resilience, but it's critical to be thinking about people and their mobility patterns, but it's not just that. It's also about how we can make those have much more connection to nature and be increasing the connections between people and nature as part of their mobility within the city. And that's just like one little aspect. I think it's also connecting this up across all of these sectors and silos. And that's not a small challenge either, right? This is, to me, again, really rethinking about how our cities work. So a radical greening of the city could be amazing, but it's not going to happen without the way in which we rethink governance, social institutions, financial flows, especially financial flows that can support communities that actually know how to do this work already within themselves. So I guess maybe this is sort of a question to everyone is where do you see your work, or where do you see maybe some opportunities for really scaling up what might be happening in one place that can work across the kinds of sectors that we know that we're going to have to connect up better if we're going to have resilient cities in some generalizable way. That's for anyone.
Maybe I can pick it up in regards of the silos, because this resonates a lot with the work that we are doing in Hamburg, because it's not only about the silos that we all have in our minds. It's also about data silos, for example, right? So we store all the data that we have to plan our cities in silos. And that is a very convenient kind of way, but the problem is that it's not interoperable then. So if you plan a city, you need to integrate all those different kind of data sets to make it accessible. And with this project, for example, like this tree planting robot, we discovered that the city doesn't have the data about the heat islands, which is absolutely not understandable. So I think those different kind of data sets we need. If you want to break down the silos, you first need to collect the data, of course, but then you need to make them correspondent to each other, really. But that's just a small remark on how to tackle those wicked problems that you were addressing.
Sometimes it's also how we involve the communities. I remember I was involved in, there was this grant to create new green spaces in the city of Montreal, and like in some cities in North America, the distribution of green spaces is not very equal. So I came to this meeting very well prepared. I looked at the temperature maps, I looked at the vegetation maps, so I knew very well which neighborhoods I thought we should create these green spaces. And what happened, this was something that each neighborhood could submit projects. And those neighborhoods that needed those spaces, they didn't submit any proposal because they didn't have the capacity to develop these proposals. And back then I remember, why wasn't I involved beforehand? Because maybe I would be much more helpful if I could have come before, like at the very beginning of the project, and we could have co-designed something. So I think sometimes how we think about, let's make a new space or let's create something good, but then there is so many obstacles along the way, and at the end we end up giving money to a neighborhood that already had some nice green spaces and submit a really nice proposal, and yes, that was it, but I don't think we made the biggest impact. So there's so many things we need to consider, and yeah, things change, but we really need to work with everyone. I've been very open that I came super well prepared to the meeting, and in the end it was not worth anything. So yeah, I think involving everyone, it's a key aspect. If it's in Montreal, it's in Freiburg, it's everywhere.
Can we comment that I just have one comment to do on systems? It's kind of a plea. A long time ago I went to nonprofits. One of the biggest issues for nonprofits to do is to create an accessible resource center. And these resources aren't available to the excuse the word today, the army, the communities that you need. So I'm sitting here listening to you all thinking, if you're out in the world and you're finding a way to create
the resources and the labs that the people in the cities and towns can access, because it's really what we need. I mean, you have the intelligence, you can hear the intelligence, but, and then the other comment I want to make, because I come from architecture and design, is that you've probably seen that there are tools today where you can build a building with all the trades seeing the impact of their work on the building. So I would say that there are technologists out there that are pretty scrappy that also could create the resource for you to simulate what it would look like to have the multiple trades, the robot and the tree, hang out together. Anyway, I'm sort of making a plea to you being here today that without those resource labs, without those things being made accessible, without them being communicated in a way that isn't overwhelming, you'll keep talking. Forgive me, I'm telling you what you know, but as somebody who would like to roll up her sleeves and help, I'll give you my last example and I'll stop, but you said systems, so I woke up. The neighborhood I live in is on a hill, and the water runs down the hill, and the houses at the bottom of the hill are the ones that are the least expensive and are currently inhabited in my town by the retirees. So I wish my town got a consultant and made a map with zones and said, Zone 3, it's a sandbag week. Zone 1, you're looking great, go down the hill and put the sandbags in Zone 3. So I also think there are kind of systems and tools that towns could bring, neighbors of the city could bring, and then you would have it at your farmer's market and say the 2-week outlook is this, and zones 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is what you could do. So that's on here. I gave my wish list.
For all of you, would you mind just introducing yourself so we know who you are and who you're with?
Yeah, I'm currently a menace. Too much time on my hands. Alexandra Alfaro. I come from a background in experience design, which is about all of the disciplines constantly intersecting. And I'm currently walking around street corners making this plea to whoever will support.
Thank you so much. And this is a note to all of you. We're interacting. Thank you for kicking us off with the first audience question. So good on you.
I definitely want to pick this up, but does anybody else want to comment first? I mean, when you first said resources, I wasn't sure exactly what you meant, but we had already started talking about data gaps a little bit. So one of the things I think is that you're going to see some change in terms of the availability and access to data. I'm quite optimistic about that, and I'll give you an example of what I think is coming. And yet, it's not magically going to happen because a lot of data holders are in the private sector, and just like we need private sector to get on board in terms of adaptation finance, because there's finance gaps in terms of resources, private sector has got to open up data because we can be more innovative if it's open access. So I'll just say that, but I'm going to offer a specific example of how I think things are changing. AI was mentioned earlier in the previous talk. Right now, the buzz around AI is all the LLMs and generative AI, etc. The old school AI around machine learning is still innovative, and there's a lot of amazing things that are happening there. And I'll just mention one, which is that slide that I showed that is the result of millions of dollars of modeling for New York City to have a scenario where flooding is likely to happen so you can prioritize investments that will now enable billions of dollars to be prioritized in the areas that have the most likelihood of flooding. That's critical, right? And as you mentioned, most cities and towns don't have that. There's over 5,000 cities and towns in the United States. 99% of them do not have that. There's, 1.9 million cities and towns around the world. Almost 100% of them do not have that kind of information. But we can learn from where those cities do have that and feed, in this case, machine learning models, data, land use, land cover, building height, where the streets are, where the roads are, outputs from hydrological models, urban heat island models, etc. And those machines are going to be able to generate outputs that can provide this at global scale. And I'm not just making this up. We just received funding from Google.org to do this work, and it is committed and contracted to be open access and free and to be provided in an intuitive and simple way to start. So this work is coming. We need to get there faster. Everyone needs it today. But I do think we're going to see a sea change around that. And my reverse plea on the data side is that private sector get involved and see that this will benefit them too, to know how their assets will be at risk, and how can we work together around that.
And I have a plea of my own, which is, I love it. But I think, right, your question's really important because it's about access, right? It's about accessibility and fairness of information, which is really important. There's a couple things, right? As this emerges and as the tools change and as they become more sophisticated and, in theory, more democratic, right? Google and Google Earth Engine and these modeling platforms are technically all open access now. Anyone can download remotely sensed data from a Landsat satellite, right? And my plea, and this is part of why I work at a university also, is that universities are uniquely positioned to offer not only publicly transparent data and access, but data alone doesn't make a decision. And access to data alone doesn't make a decision, and we really need to be critical of what we mean by fair, because a lot of that comes down to capacities to translate and work with in order to make better and empowered decisions. Does that make sense? So that's a lot of what I do a lot of thinking about, is assuming the map alone is impactful, but the conversations and how you socialize or engage, the value system that sits behind why that map was created in the first place, why the people at the bottom of the hill are the least expensive properties, there's a reason for that, right? So we need to be equipped to have that level of conversation, because the map alone won't have it for us. And then we also need to be equipped with better answers for what to do with that information. And that gets, I think, to a bit of your earlier question, which is what do we need to scale up? And two sides of that, right? One, when we're talking about adaptation and resilience, these are highly contextual. And if we're really taking the theory of adaptation and resilience as far as it can go, we're talking about hyper-local decisions, right? We're talking about hyper-local movements to major global change. And part of the work of this is about recognizing that the solutions, unlike our mind, which wants to tell us that this technology will be the scalable thing and the bullet that will help us, the solutions themselves are these like units of examples of things that can happen or take root. They're like these seeds or ideas, but their application or how they become material, the solution itself, will look different and should be contextual with what a community needs or a place needs and values, which is where the idea of partnership comes in and plays in really, really strongly. I think partnerships that are centered with that set of values have the durability to answer all of those questions. And the third thing I would say as it relates to scale is networks of learning, right? So if we assume that there are lots of ideas and lots of information, and in many places we know a lot, even if there's a data poor place, right? Somebody knows a lot. So thinking about how, as a collective group, we are creating spaces for some of these challenges to emerge, and funding and financing not just the technical solutions, but the networks of people that are needed to step forward, connect, and support communities. So I'd offer that as... Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
1 second, I have the mic.
Because we have a unique thing that really is 100% on the point of what you're saying, which is so important. Just want to super emphasize that. So Tufts University and NYU University has a program together with the Red Cross. And one of the things we do is we take the data, the scientific data, about what kind of weather events are going to affect a particular location. The Red Cross has us starting with locations that have already had some kind of a disaster crisis, you know, like Butte, California, or Yazoo County in Alabama, whatever. And what we do is we have a group of scholars, young scholars, and they look at the emergency procedures and rules and laws and funding and grants that are already in place in that community, and we do what we call a policy inventory. And then we compare that policy inventory to other communities that may have experienced different kind of disasters. And then we take that information and we do a scenarios training exercise in each community. And one of the things we focus on, really strikingly, is not just presenting the community with the scientific weather information, which of course is extremely important, and removes that data gap. So now I know what you know at the university about what could happen 10 years from now in my location. But we have the community with civil groups and first responders and so forth do an exercise where we make them pretend that we created disaster for them based on the science, and then they have to respond to what they would think they would do in that case, and we try to seriously tease out which communities are most in harm's way. Do you have a communication strategy for those communities? Do you have a plan for those communities? And it's been a very powerful experience for us, because we're only 1 year in, because every community we've talked to has some disadvantaged community that is indeed left out of the resilience plan. And so I think it's exactly what you're saying. And I think universities can play a leading role, but I mentioned the Red Cross because our partnership with the Red Cross, it happens that there's a professor at Tufts who's a climate scientist who had helped the Red Cross. But then moving that to a more active role where our students and the Red Cross, and we're all working together to go community to community. And we have thought about how could we partner with universities around the country so that if we develop this methodology and we can show it's really helping the community, then each local university in each of these communities could do the same thing in each location, even globally, but certainly in the United States, together with the Red Cross or some other similar organization. I just want to share that as sort of a methodology. Look forward to talking to you since we're both based in New York.
Thank you, Amy. Now there's a chance for all of you back there to ask a question, because we had questions from here already. So why don't we do that? Is that okay? Anybody? Sarah.
Sarah Epps. So many of you have touched on different types of infrastructure, physical city infrastructure, data infrastructure. What's some of the human infrastructure and community service investments we should be thinking about to overcome some of the challenges and the opportunities that you're describing?
Shall I start? So, for instance, when I work with trees, and I will go back to trees as I always go, sorry, I often say that I work with urban forests, and it's only an urban forest because in a city. If there was no city, if there was no people, it would not be an urban forest. So we cannot take care of this, we cannot plan it if we do not put pictures in the people in the picture. We cannot just go and plant trees if people do not want trees. And a lot of people do not want trees. So I think it's also our job to understand that. And sometimes what we need to do is to explain to people why we think having a tree is good, or having a park, or something else. So just going there and pushing a tree or forcing a tree will not solve anything. But also understanding that, like, it's very good to say, like, we can generalize and we can learn and apply things everywhere. It's not always true. So even if we have data for some things that we learn here, they will not work somewhere else because the people are different and they want different things. So the one solution fits all really doesn't work. So I think going out and trying to understand why different people want different things It will work for flooding, it will work for trees, for everything. I remember like before, like we could easily see the price of the houses going up if you had a tree, if you had shade, something like that. These days it's no longer the case because storms are more frequent, so they provoke damage. In the western coast you have the fires, so in California the insurance companies stop insuring houses for climate change. So even the communities that were the healthiest communities, they are also very, very impacted, and it's completely different from the other communities. So I think the work should start really early on to know what the community wants. And if it doesn't want trees, then it's not, maybe we meet with a different colleague that can come up and offer a different solution. But I think first is to understand the needs. And I think that is lacking a lot of times, is to start by understanding what are the needs.
I love the question, thank you. Because you're talking about social fabric, right? You're talking about the human dimension of this and not the physical one. And I'd offer a couple things. One is, as it relates to like response and resilience, people are amazing in cities at organizing themselves, right? Every time, I mean, I'm a New Yorker, so I'm a little bit biased. I'm super proud of our capacities to do this, but this is a human thing, right? People organize in their communities. So I think things that enable, promote, and uplift and invest in the dedicated people in communities who are already doing that hard work, things like mutual aid, things like food service, delivery, and network. These are the people who are like checking on older folks in their home when it's really hot out to make sure that they've turned their air conditioner on and they can pay their utility bill, and if they can't, give them a phone number to call for someone that can help. These are like the micro investments, I think, that need to be made. The second thing I'd say is young people. We have an incredible amount of energy in young people that needs to be captured, enlivened, and invested in, and taken seriously. And I think that anything that trains, enables, gathers, or supports young people in defining the vision for the future that they want and supporting them with the tools and skills that they need to make that a reality is a good investment to make. I think the third thing, and I want to pick up on, I think it was something that was said during the first panel around like things that we do, right, as people when we're considering our own resilience as a human unit, right? Like you take a walk in nature, you take a rest, you meditate, you exercise, you connect with your family and friends, you maybe take a break, you do these things, right? I would also say that when we're thinking about human systems, remembering that that is a privilege for a lot of us to be able to take a break. And I think that anything that supports communities for whom climate is an existential, real, material risk in life, but don't have the brain space to think about what to do or show up to a meeting to contemplate that because you're taking care of kids and you're going to a job. Things that respect that people need time and space to just process the complexity of the world that we live in. That's also an investment because it respects the human dignity that it takes to overcome collective challenges. I know that's not like a climate solution, but that's what I would say. Yeah.
All right, everybody. As much as I said I will be keeping time, I will also be inviting you for the first coffee break. But before we do that, round of applause for our first panel. The idea during the coffee break is, of course, to keep on talking with them and with everybody else. So we'll take a short break and continue at 2:30.